Welcome to Know What I Mean. My name's Oscar.
My name's George, and this was a really, I don't know about if fun is quite the right word, but it was a really good episode. I think like we talked through some really interesting things, and we had one thing that doesn't happen every episode, but I really enjoy when it does, is when we have little realizations within the episode. Like we have little things where, we've both been thinking about this quote, throughout the week, but we have a little thing where it kind of clicks for both of us in a different way, and we see it, in a new light, or we see a different facet of the quote. And yeah, I really love those moments. And yeah, it doesn't happen every episode, and that's kind of what makes it quite special. We can have, episodes that I've really enjoyed that haven't had that, but it's a nice little moment when it happens. So yeah, that was one of the reasons why I really enjoyed this one.
I really enjoyed making notes for this episode. It was really, really fun to invest a bit more time this week in really going into it, and it felt different in a way. It felt a more confident episode for me. I feel when we were recording, what we could bring up and really get into and get stuck into felt like a rich episode. Yeah, and very much hope you enjoy it.
Let's get into it.
You'd be surprised what lengths people will go to not face what's real and painful inside them. This is by a character called Kester in a show called My Mad Fat Diary. And Kester in this show is he's the therapist of the main character, and he's quite an eccentric guy, bit of a rebel, very likable. And this show, My Mad Fat Diary, is excellent. I was highly recommending it at the end of last episode. And it's just a very honest view into mental health and what it's like to grow up and be a teenager. And yeah, I loved it. Highly recommend. Anyway, this episode is not about My Mad Fat Diary. It's about this particular quote.
As much as you're trying to make it about that show. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. What drew me to this quote is, well, I think what is being talked about in this quote is something very fundamental to being a human being, which is this aspect of being alive and having a mind, which is that we have dark things within us, whether they be traumatic things or aspects of our character we find difficult. And it's such a huge part of the human experience to avoid those things. We spend so much energy and time in very obvious and very subtle ways trying to avoid our experience. And it's such a huge part of the human experience. And yet it's an area that we don't talk about a huge amount. Just how, I suppose, because it's a really difficult thing to admit that you are running away from things within yourself. It's just not, that doesn't, even though it's such a huge part of our experience of being alive and having a mind, it's not something that you openly admit regularly, because you'd have to be willing to be very vulnerable to be able to do that. And it's so normalized, it's such this background static and just normal way of being, that we're dealing with suffering and we're dealing with trauma and we're dealing with emotional baggage that we're choosing to turn away from. It's just such a normal part of being alive that we forget how much it shapes our experience. And yeah, it's so prominent. So one way I've heard it describe this underlying discomfort that we all have is by 𝗚𝗲𝗿, spiritual teacher 𝗚𝗲𝗿 Tolle. He describes it as the pain body. And the pain body is like a backlog of unresolved or unprocessed trauma or kind of difficulty that basically is simmering in our experience the majority of the time. And some people have a very large pain body in quotations, and some it's just a very, very minor form of suffering. But we all have this kind of underlying just stuff that we've, for whatever reason, chosen to not actually process as it's arisen. And instead it remains in the body, hence the pain body. It's something that stays within our body. And how this pain body or this unresolved stuff, it will periodically rear up as outbursts or like issues that kind of come up. But a lot of the time it's just kind of simmering in the background. It's just a light static that's in the background. And our lengths that we take to avoid what's real and painful inside of us, as in this background static, that is as a response to this minor discomfort. And, you know, obvious ways that we avoid stuff are like through, say, overeating or eating badly, watching too much TV, watching too much YouTube, playing RuneScape.
Guilty.
Social media, Instagram, I might save myself. And those are maybe more obvious ways, and we can talk about other ways that might come up. But yeah, I guess the reason why I picked this is just it's how we avoid actually talking about this, and yet it's just intrinsic to being a human being. And I find that very interesting, how it's something that we all experience, and yet it's something we very rarely talk about. So
yeah,
I'll hand over to you.
Yeah,
George.
Well, it is really something that does. It's a constant practice. I definitely don't feel that I'm very close to this completely being eradicated from my life, that my pain body is just gonna like float off and become like a pleasure body or whatever. Or whatever happens. But like, I mean, I think I talked about this before actually, like how I had a thing where I've stopped sort of binge watching lots of content. And because I noticed that, you know, I'd get home and I'd be about to make some food, and then I'd be like, right, I need to find something cool to watch or like a good podcast to listen to. And I was spending all this time trying to find something to distract myself. And that really is this. It's this feeling of slight discomfort. It's not at that point verbal. It's not like a clear thing of something I'm avoiding. Sometimes it can be a specific thing that you know in your head that you're avoiding, but very often it's just not turned into words. It's just a feeling. It's just a feeling, and you're trying to repress that feeling. And at least for me, you know, I feel like this can come up regularly on a day-to-day basis. I will feel, you know, a need to distract myself and to not give space to those feelings. And I find that I feel so much better when I do give the space for those things to arise. It's the same way that you keep your house clean. You know, it's going to just get dirty naturally. It's going to build up and you need to clean it. That really is the process. I think of it as the same way you maintain a house. You know, you might have some large structural things, you know, like some really big things that you need to deal with. You know, that's more like really repairing your house. Like there's damp in your house, or there's, you know, some rotting lintel or something like that. You sometimes need to really get in there and like do some like major work or make a big change. And things like a retreat, for example, like I know you've spoken about that, how you've had, you know, some really big things come up for you, or, you know, one in particular, like a really big thing come up that you just hadn't really addressed or hadn't been ready to process. So sometimes you really need to leave yourself more space. You know, that can be through retreats or talking through with a therapist or through psychedelic experiences, all sorts of tools that are used, and obviously things that, you know, you need to be careful with because you are dealing with, you know, potentially like some traumatic, pretty serious stuff. So definitely something to be like, that can be very fruitful, but also something that, you know, you shouldn't just dive into without really thinking about. But yeah, I see there are those things that can really help you deal with some of the really big shit, you know, some of the things that you might not be aware of. And that's the big structural things. And then you've just got, you know, like the everyday things like cleaning your carpet or whatever it is, doing the washing up. And that's just like little things that come up, little discomforts, little, maybe a minor little resentment that started to build up because you weren't fully honest with someone, or, you know, you didn't tell someone that they were crossing a boundary, and you're now kind of holding this thing that, you know, that they should have known not to do that, or whatever it is. These little things, you know, depending on your personality, you're going to have certain things which arise fairly regularly. So yeah, I think it's super important to have these little micro moments throughout your day of, you know, a habit that I haven't done for a while actually, but I love, is just going for a morning walk. just I start the day. It's a really great place for things to arise, like any concerns or anxieties about the day, or things that I'm excited about as well. And it's just an empty space to allow those things to come through, to address any things, and to kind of get my day started right with a kind of, you know, a clean slate. And then for the bigger things, you know, there's ways to deal that through meditation retreats and psychedelics and therapy and all sorts of different things that can work for people.
Yeah, I like the comparison to maintaining a house, because it is true. Our emotional lives is, you know, it can be compared to that in a way. And there is stuff that's really fundamentally like an issue that you have to deal with, such as damp. Like, and then there's really small things just like cleaning up. So it's quite a nice little comparison there between, you know, more day-to-day emotional maintenance and really big stuff. I suppose so. In a way, we've talked about you know, facing what's real and painful and how that might look and how we might compare that. And I think one of the things about this quote is you'd be surprised what lengths people will go to not face what's real and painful inside of them. So this aspect of, you know, it can be quite extreme how we choose to avoid things. So like one of the things that I get reminded of a lot when I'm in Manchester, because as much as I love Manchester, which is where I'm based, you know, it's a really vibrant place and it's very kind of interesting to look at, and there's loads of stuff going on, but it can be quite dark. It's quite gritty as well. There's this part of the city centre called Piccadilly Gardens, and it's just like a hub of most of the mad shit I've seen in Manchester. Like quite horrible stuff has happened there for whatever reason. And I think what's being referred to is, you know, you'd be surprised what lengths people go to, is very, very obvious in a space like that, because there's a lot of criminality, a lot of drug taking, a lot of violence, and just a vibe of very aggressively pushing away lots of stuff that just hasn't been processed. So when you see people there being violent to one another or being absolutely off their nut, you know, beyond fun, I think most people would agree that that's not a reflection of people having a good time, and it's not a reflection of people even being kind of anarchistic and wanting to live in an alternative way. It's a reflection of, you know, real sorrow. Like there's a lot of pain there, and pretty much guarantee that most of the people in those circumstances would choose to not be in them if they could. And yet there's stuff that's obviously so big to deal with that it's led a lot of people down a path of violence and real difficulty, which is so obvious when you walk through, because the vibe is just there's just like a really quite like strange sort of energy and kind of like there's a real kind of edge to it that's quite uncomfortable. So that's kind of that's an extreme, and that's kind of a length that is quite obvious in this space, and every city will have an equivalent of Piccadilly Gardens. But I wanted to talk about, well, I suppose an aspect of my life that I've noticed this come up in. So I recently have, I guess invented these little nitrous oxide canister baubles for Christmas trees. And it's been a project that I've worked on for ages. And like I'd been building up to this point 1 week ago when I actually wanted to not release the baubles to be sold, but just like as an idea, because it had been an idea that I'd been working on for ages. And I was getting to this point of feeling like there was some resistance to putting it out there. And I was just like, okay, I'm going to put these out there. I don't know how the response is going to be, right? But I'm just going to put this idea out there that I've been working on. And I put a video up on my Instagram of these baubles, and the response to them was so positive. Like I was just having loads of DMs from people saying like, oh, this is really like innovative, and these are so beautiful, these things, like they're really, really nice, like da da da. And I was just, loving it. It was just great because it had been a project that I'd been working on for ages, and it was just so nice to have people be so appreciative of it. So I decided, okay, I'll release these in a few days' time. This showed me that there was interest, and I was thinking, okay, I'll release these in a few days' time. So over the course of the previous few days, in fact, because I released them 2 days ago. I was creating all the boxes for them. I was like getting everything prepared and continuing to kind of build things up on my Instagram for this big release. And I put them up for sale and like nothing happens. And I feel really kind of dejected by it. I feel like quite upset about it, really, because as much as I know I shouldn't care about, like I knew that they were a good product. I knew people said that they were good. The fact that there was just so little interest as soon as I put them up for sale really hit me, and it really made me feel like my self-esteem was basically affected by it, and it kind of ruined my day. And it just got me thinking about how in my life I seem to have designed my life in a way where I set up points of praise on a regular basis. I put things out on Instagram. I put myself in positions where I can receive praise, and I can receive, well, people can just say how good the stuff I'm doing is and things like that. Mm-hmm. And how that manifests is a desire to create and have output and to be seen. And the sense of it is of being kind of topped up. Like I'm looking for this kind of praise, and I'm being topped up. And it happens to be that I'm now in a career where that happens on a regular basis. And I guess it got me thinking about, through this experience of putting something out there and it really not going as I had hoped, that there is actually a shadow side to this position that I've put myself in, which seems like a fairly harmless thing to like want praise. But really the shadow side is a fear of being ignored or being ordinary in a way. Like a desire to be special is like a fear, in my experience, is a fear of ordinariness, of just being basically unnoticed, unnotable. And the deeper fear of that is like having a sense of not having intrinsic worth, that I need to prove that I'm worthwhile, that I need to show that I'm worthwhile. Otherwise, I'm not worthwhile. And like, it might feel like I'm sort of running towards this kind of shiny sense of praise, but really what's quite often behind that is an avoidance of this lack of self-worth or intrinsic self-worth, and a fear of just dissolving, of not actually being anything or anyone or anyone worth noting. And it was just interesting that, like, of noticing it in regards to this quote, of just that this is quite an extreme length I've gone to, quite unconsciously, to put myself in a position where I receive praise to be able to avoid a more existential concern of just being nothing or nobody. Mm-hmm. And I just found this really interesting, that like it was something that seemed quite harmless. And, this isn't the whole story of my work and why I create, but it's one aspect of it. But it actually, looking at it, does feel like quite an extreme length to avoid something.
Yeah, well, I think so much of why, that's pretty much why people do anything, though, is to seek things or to avoid things. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's showing really how important this quote, or how much scope there is that this quote covers, that it really is a huge thing. So much of what we do is motivated by either wanting to feel loved or not wanting to feel unloved, not wanting to be abandoned, not wanting to be fear, criticism, or whatever it is, that is, a huge driver, of human behavior. Often it can be things in our childhood that we felt, and from a perfectly happy childhood, these things are naturally going to arise, that you felt good when you were, got praise for some, cool drawing you did as a kid or whatever. And that, naturally you wanted to do that more, as you grew up. But yeah, I guess I hadn't really thought about this quote on that scale, as like, really this is the thing behind, why people do most of the stuff they do. So much stuff comes from this place of not wanting to feel whatever negative things that you might have felt as a child, perhaps. Yeah, no, I definitely hadn't thought of it on that scale.
And so I suppose the most obvious thing that I thought of initially was just, we distract ourselves from stuff that we're uncomfortable with. The stuff we're uncomfortable with might be like stuff that's really just drilled into us or from a young age, for example, and it's personal to us. Like there's quite, you know, we've all got our own kind of emotional baggage we built up in time, and we are looking through food and sex and all these things to not have to deal with that. Obviously it doesn't work, but that is what we're looking to do. And but we all have our own versions of why we're doing that. But there is this other side of things, which is this kind of more existential avoidance, which is quite intrinsic to just being a person. And as we mentioned with meditation retreats, like this came up for me, this kind of existential avoidance or not wanting to be with what is, the other night when I was meditating, and I got really concentrated, and then suddenly my usual state of being, most people's usual state of being, is sort of feeling like the present moment is kind of sandwiched between the past and the future. And even though you might not be seemingly thinking about the past and the future, there's this sense that you are lodged in between the two, and the future's just there, and it is real, and it's a solid thing, and it's just right around the corner. That sense of future just went through this meditation by accident. It just sort of disappeared, and I couldn't get it back. And so I was really uncomfortable. It totally surprised me.
Wow.
I was just like, wow, my whole sense of future is gone. And then what came up from that was this much more existential sense of avoidance, of just feeling really uncomfortable with the fact that this really practical, useful illusion of the future was not real. And that was very unfamiliar as a space. And so a lot of what I do is to avoid having to deal with these really quite foundational human things of just like that we keep in place because it keeps us in a sense of control, or with a sense of control and comfort, such as future and past, such as free will, such as, you know, a sense of meaning. These like really fundamental things are like, it's because without them, that it's very unsettling, like not having those things there. And sometimes what we're doing through our, for example, watching TV, is not necessarily that we're not wanting to look at some trauma that we've got individually, but it's that silence, just like space itself, is quite threatening, because there's nothing to hold on to in silence and space. It's just open. And that can be scary. It can be a lot more nice to have stuff to make us feel like we're contained within this particular space, and that there's relativity and all this kind of stuff. And when that's not there, it can be really like, like I had the other night, like, shit, this is quite like uncomfortable actually. Like, I don't know if I like this very much. And luckily, like a part of me really knew that it was very healthy to feel like that. That's like a very, very interesting, good thing to explore. But it was, quite funny, bit of a shock.
Wow. That's an interesting thought about the silence of it kind of being like, this openness where you're kind of untethered. You know, normally there's things to ground you. There's things to really connect you to your environment, and for you to feel like, oh yeah, this is me. I'm here watching TV, or I'm doing these things. And that there's this, a strange openness, like that can be, you know, like the open ocean, or being like in space or something. Like it can be kind of unnerving. I also think as well, and this is complete armchair psychology, but I was just thinking, like, it might be as well that sometimes when people are still, they have thoughts that they're scared of, or things that they don't want to think about, that those arise as soon as they give space for them. And I think that that's something I've done to some extent. And I think it's quite a common thing that people can do, that is like, they know that when they're still, those thoughts can come in. So they kind of condition themselves to be scared of those moments of emptiness, because they're worried about, or, you know, they remember the last time they stopped and just relaxed, and like all this shit came in. And that's something that I think we've kind of touched on here and talked about before, of it being healthy to leave space for those things, And it might, it might take a little while of clearing out that junk drawer, because especially if it's not something you've done before, you've not spent a lot of time doing that, but it can be a really liberating experience. Like I think when I first started to explore this sort of stuff, just letting those things come through, and you will work through it. It's not like constant, like it's not like never ending, even though like new things will arise, but like you can get a lot of stuff out and just make it so that, when you are still, there's not loads of massive things that pop into your head that are like really messed up in your life, or things you need to deal with, or massive insecurities. Like there's still going to be bits and bobs that come in, but as you kind of work through clearing out these things, you can find that you'll be more comfortable with those space. Like I think I'm generally pretty, although sometimes I definitely do avoid it, but I'm generally like pretty cool with silence and just literally just like lying on my bed thinking and like being completely open to whatever arises. I enjoy doing that. So yeah, I think it's like a good process to be able to go through that and to feel comfortable and to learn to feel more comfortable in those open spaces.
There'll be a scientific term for this. I don't know what it is. This is a famous explanation, but again, I don't know the reference for it. That's just, I don't know, if you're a long-term listener, then you will know that me and George don't really have the names, the facts, the figures, unfortunately.
Well,
we just rely on our reasoning.
Yeah.
It's a bit of it is a shame sometimes, but that's just how our minds work.
Synthesize nameless knowledge.
Yeah, exactly. But this thing with space, it makes total sense of fear of it, and why you'd feel a bit disorientated by it potentially. If you imagine in outer space, I think Alan Watts might talk about this. If you've got 2 points in space, imagine there's nothing else in space. You've only got these 2 little spheres, right? The space between them can only exist if there's 2 of them, because then you can see how far away it is. One is from each other. There can even be a sense of kind of direction because there's 2. So you're either moving to the left of this thing or the right of this thing, or, far away or close. Whereas when there's only one thing in space, there's no direction. There isn't any relativity. There's no sense of distance between things. There has to be more than one thing for that to exist.
Yeah.
And so that is why when there is mental silence, because what thoughts do is they create relativity. They create a mental space where there are different things in different spots at different distances in different points of time that make it feel like you're kind of within something, and your thoughts are relative to something. This is a bigger thought. This is a smaller thought. This is etc. When the thought isn't there, then really it's very difficult to actually gauge how you relate to anything anymore. And that is the usual way of being is relativity, is dualism, 2 of. And when that's suddenly not there, it makes total sense that you're like, shit, like how do I form myself? It's like I know that I have a particular opinion because someone else has a different opinion, and I'm able to form an opinion based on the difference between my opinion and someone else's, and that helps, that creates an edge in which I can see where I am. Whereas if that thing isn't there, if the thing that comparative element isn't there, you don't know how to orient yourself anymore, and it's scary. And so it makes total sense that there's this fear of space. Anyway, slight tangent, but I do think it's really interesting. And like as we've kind of round back to this quote, it's like you'd be surprised at what lengths people go to not face what's real and painful inside of them. Well, it's like that's talking, maybe it's giving an emphasis on extremities, really. Like how far will you go to not experience what's going on? But really, we've talked in this episode about like quite ordinary ways that we avoid what's real and painful within ourselves, like from minor distraction to the reason why we might not want to, look at this stuff. And I think it's definitely worth reflecting more on, what am I avoiding now? Because there's something in this moment. If you're not totally blissed out at total peace and feeling one with the universe, which you may be, and I'm jealous, then, you know, there is avoidance. I can feel it in myself. You know, it's like I've got a slight stomach ache, you know, and I don't want it to be there, and I don't want to look at it, and I don't want to feel it. I just want it to go away. And, you know, we all have those experiences going on all the time, and it's just like avoidance is intrinsic to being alive, and it's also like one of those things that's just super worth looking at and getting familiar with and understanding better. And
well, that sounds like a good place to move on to the next quote. Well, boom, it's 𝗚𝗲𝗿 actually. It's funny you just mentioned something that might have been from him. So, you know, that's a connection. And this quote is, "One is a great deal less anxious if one feels perfectly free to be anxious." Lots of great stuff in this that I'm excited to get into. And yeah, thanks for listening. Hope you've been enjoying the episode and enjoying the podcast in general. Oscar actually shared with me a little message that someone who bought one of the baubles put, which was like Christmas rips if you make it rip. And that was like a really cool little thing to get. Like, I don't know, it's just funny to hear like something that we've talked about on this podcast is like a nice little reminder that, you know, that there's people who are listening to this and enjoying it, and like, you know, it's influencing them, or they're thinking about some of the things that they've heard on this episode. So yeah, that's really awesome to hear. Thanks for the message. Hope you don't mind Oscar violating your privacy by sharing it with me. Yeah, so hope you enjoyed. Share this podcast with other people if you want to spread this out to other people who you think would enjoy it as well. Thanks for listening. Have a great week, and we'll see you next week. Peace.